So you are the prospective monarch of a European state. In a few years, you'll be coming to the throne of your forefathers, becoming the king of your fatherland. Normally, that would be very exciting, but your case is not one to be much celebrated. Your country is a small European nation only a few years older than you. Even though you are becoming a king, it's not like you'll be reigning over a vast colonial empire like the monarchs of England and France, or a powerful military like the Kaiser of Germany. No, you're just the king of Belgium, a tiny country stuffed between the great powers of Europe. Surrounded by the big guys, you've always dreamt of a huge empire like your neighbors, an empire of vast territories and immense resources. Tiny Belgium is just a country too small and a people too few to be fit for you, the ambitious monarch. You just despised your destitute situation. But you cannot quit like that. No, the power and the profits that come with the possession of an empire are just too seducing to let go of so easily. Thus you give yourself a promise. One way or another, you will eventually be ruling over an empire. You, Leopold II, king of the Belgians, shall be an emperor.
Unexploited mineral wealth like diamonds and gold, estimated at $23 trillion.
Then Leopold II in Belgium, the most notorious symbolism of European exploitation of Africa, and especially Central Africa. 10 million people estimated killed under Leopold II's personal enrichment colonial scheme.
It's mid-1860s and you have just become the king of teeny Belgium, but your desire for a colony has grown stronger than ever. You are relentlessly searching for colonial opportunities all over the globe, but by that time much of the world had already been seized by other powerful empires. Asia was full to the brim, with the Russian Empire stretching over the entirety of its northern half, and to the south the British were all over the place, from Yemen to India. What the British didn't control was either under French rule or other empires too powerful to conquer, like Persia and China. Meanwhile, in the Americas, much of the territories had already been exploited for centuries by the Spanish, the British, the French and the Dutch. Yet despite all the odds, you tried to purchase some colonial territories from the Portuguese and the Dutch, but to no avail. Thus, you only have two choices left. One is to establish your colonial empire in the white fields of Antarctica and rule over an empire of penguins. And the other more logical option was to get yourself a colony in Africa. And ironically, the king went for the latter. For the aspiring colonizer of the late 1860s, Africa was a logical place to look for a colony. While the other parts of the world had already been under colonial exploitation since the beginning of the 16th century, much of Africa was a virgin land, left intact by European colonizers. Except for some territories along the coast, much of the interior was inaccessible for Europeans, thanks to the hostile tropical ecosystem. As a result, as much as 80% of African territory was under African control. Thus, for King Leopold, it was the perfect place to get started with his colonial venture. But before you conquer a colony and start turning a profit on it, you need to have the skills necessary to run a colonial business. The king went through thousands of Spanish and Dutch colonial documents, studying techniques of colonial business management, administration and resource extraction, all of which he needed to understand very well if his colonial venture was to become a success. But that's not all. If you are going to build your colonial empire in Africa, you need to know about Africa. Leopold spent thousands of hours reading various studies of the continent's interior, carefully following the reports of Africa explorers and meeting some of them in person to discuss about their experiences. While enthusiastically digging information about his potential colonies in Africa, he discovered that the most promising of them was the central part of the continent. The king was moving in the right direction, and prospects were looking brighter by the day. Now he needed to get started with the real business. But being the shrewd monarch that he was, he knew that he shouldn't be overt with his power moves. Oh no, that's not how things are done. If you just went and told everyone that you are gonna subjugate African land and establish a colony there, they'll be mad at you. The people in Belgium didn't want any expensive colonial wars, and the great powers won't let you capture swaths of African land under their nose. To seem too power-hungry is just too dangerous. Thus, he decided to play it smart. Rather than outright coercion, he chose the way of deception. While eagerly swimming through Royal Geographical Society papers on Africa, he had noticed that the Arab slave trade was flourishing in Central Africa. Arab-African slave traders were constantly raiding Central African towns to enslave their people. This gave him the ultimate pretext. Much like the politicians of latter centuries, Leopold the shrewd monarch knew that in pursuit of your tyrannical objectives, nothing was more effective in swaying public opinion than humanitarian narratives of liberation and protection.
American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Thus, in the name of protecting the people from Arab slavers, he decided to set his colonial foot on the promising continent. He told everyone how much he was concerned about the misery of the poor Africans enslaved by the evil Arabs, how much their agony pained him, how much he despised the evil Arab slavers that was constantly attacking the innocent Africans. To garner further support for his ambitions, he threw comments on the quote uncivilized status of the Africans and the need to share European civilization with them. Carefully appealing to the ego of the Victorian era, he caught the attention of the masses. To further solidify his image as a humanitarian, he prepared a conference for the development of Africa. He invited famous anti-slavery humanitarians, missionaries, scholars, and Africa explorers. He talked about, quote, opening to civilization the only part of our globe which it has not yet penetrated, and piercing the darkness which hangs over entire peoples. And everybody buys it. Newspapers talk about it, famous people promise to send their contributions. Even Ferdinand de Lesseps, the engineer of the Suez Canal, and the Rothschilds, the bankers of Europe, sent their congratulations. By the end of his Africa conference, the participants had designed plans for, quote, civilizing work and established a humanitarian organization that would oversee the process, the International Association of Africa. And to the king's great pleasure, they made him the chairman. He nailed it. Leopold had now become everybody's favorite philanthropist monarch. The next step is mapping out your prospective colony and its riches. That Leopold couldn't do by himself, but luckily for him, somebody had already done it. While the king was pretending before humanitarians and explorers in Brussels, an American journalist named Henry Morton Stanley had traveled along the route of the Great Congo River, mapping along the way the entire region. When his journals were printed on newspaper, Leopold eagerly studied them page by page and word by word. And it turned out that Stanley had surveyed the whole of Central Africa. He had drafted a rough sketch of the exuberant riches that were to be found there. The explorer effectively mapped the Congo Basin for its prospective colonizers, or as Leopold, the philanthropist monarch would rather like to be called, protectors. Reading Stanley's newspaper articles revealed to the protector a lot about the riches of Central Africa. Most important of all was the vast river network that spread through the entire region. The king learned that only the Kasai, just one of the Congo's many tributaries, carried as much water as the Volga, the largest river in all of Europe, and it was half as long as Germany's Rhine. This vast network of the Congo River was like thousands of miles of railroad already laid without a penny having been spent. The river and its web of tributaries formed a transportation grid matched by very few places on Earth. Whoever controlled this magnificent river network would absorb to himself the trade and immense resources of the enormous basin behind it. The king had found the perfect stage for his grand colonial ambitions. The altruist shepherd that Leopold was pretending to be had found his sheep, and the greedy predator within him had found its perfect prey. This vast area in Central Africa, miraculously still unclaimed by anyone else, was to become the colony that he for so long craved. Leopold had found the stage of his play, but he needed talented actors to perform on the stage. And who'd fit that role better than the journalist explorer who charted the entire course of the Congo? Thus he contacted Stanley and offered him a job. He would become the king's foot soldier in the Congo, the star of his play, exploring the resources of the basin, signing treaty deals with native chiefs, and establishing bases that would later house his colonial chiefs and troops. But again, you cannot overtly pursue your colonial ambitions. That will bring too much trouble for you. But by now, Leopold had already got a name as a philanthropist, and he could use that to his advantage. Instead of conquering, he talked about exploring. Instead of colonial bases, he spoke of scientific and missionary bases. Instead of enslavement, he babbled about enlightenment. And as usual, everybody buys it. Thus, in the name of establishing critical infrastructure for Leopold's philanthropic ambitions in Central Africa, Stanley left for the Congo. With both the star and the stage ready, the play can finally begin. A colony is essentially a big business. You conquer the territory, extract its resources for free, enslave the people, sell the plundered wells in the international market, and amass handsome profits. But like any other business, a colony needs initial investment before it starts to turn a profit. First, you need to conquer the territory and determine what resources you can extract from your colony. Second, you need to build infrastructure to transport extraction equipment to the territory and move your plunder out to the market. Third, you need slave labor to extract the resources. And fourth, you need a colonial army enforcing your rule and forcing the enslaved to work day and night. When Stanley went to the Congo as Leopold's chief colonial executive, those were the precise tasks given to him. He started by building a road that would connect the hinterland to the coast. The road was essential because near the coast the Congo River is full of rapids and cannot be used for transportation. A road connecting the coast to the navigable part of the river was critical. Then through the newly built road and by using Congolese slave labor, Stanley transported disassembled steamboats to the interior. Once enough steamboats had been assembled, it was time for the next step. Using the steamboats, he traveled around the entire basin of the Congo, signing land lease treaties with every chief that he could find. defined. But treaty is a very deceptive word. What Stanley actually did was he asked the village chiefs to mark an X on his paper. In exchange, he offered them several bottles of alcohol and some clothes. The chiefs had no idea what they were agreeing to. It was kinda like how we blindly hit accept on the terms and conditions of every sign-up page, with the added twist of the text being in a foreign language. In a couple of articles, the treaties gave Leopold everything. Unknowingly, the chiefs signed away their sovereignty over their land, resources, and people in exchange for some clothes. Those who refused to sign the treaties were given severe punishment by Stanley's mercenary army of 1,000 heavily armed African soldiers. Their villages were ransacked and the people enslaved. One thing should be noted here. At the time, there was no unified all-powerful Congolese state in Central Africa. Although the Congo was once a powerful kingdom in Western Central Africa, centuries of slave hunting raids had severely weakened it. After the beginning of the slave trade with the Europeans in the 16th century, the kingdoms of the area attacked each other's villages seeking to enslave the people and sell them to the European traders. Over centuries, these constant raids resulted in the disintegration of Central and West African civilization in general. And to a large extent, that's what opened the door for European colonialism in Africa. For if there had been a unified state fighting outside incursion, there is no way a couple thousand mercenary soldiers would have conquered millions of square miles of territory in a mere 5 years. It is on the ashes of our disunity that colonialism laid its roots. That's a lesson we Africans should never forget. The European armies didn't even have to directly fight the African kingdoms. They exploited historical grudges to pit one tribe against the other. Once they had weakened the kingdoms in this way, all they needed was to finish off the last ones that remained. This is what enabled Europe to colonize Africa within a couple of decades. And very unfortunately, this tactic remains as instrumental today as it has always been. Back to our main story, when Stanley was done scamming Congolese chiefs, some 450 villages had fallen under Leopold's grip. If this territory was to be superimposed on a map of Europe, it would stretch from Zurich to Moscow in central Turkey, or the entire United States east of the Mississippi. It was 76 times the size of Belgium itself. Over this vast area, Stanley constructed a network of riverside bases. These were to be used as warehouses when the plunder starts arriving from the conquered land. And from there, the loot would be transported by river to the coast and then by sea to Belgium, where it will be sold for international buyers, earning huge profits for the colonial entrepreneur King Leopold II. By 1884, Stanley had finished his task of crafting Leopold's long-sought colony in the Congo. In a matter of 5 years, the king and his foot soldier had silently acquired 1/30 of Africa's territory and tens of millions of its people. Now, it was time to make it official. It was time to seek international recognition for Leopold's newly acquired colonial empire in Congo. After you are done crafting your colony, you need to get the recognition of the great powers. Otherwise, you'll be in constant conflict with great powers trespassing on your newly acquired territory. But getting diplomatic recognition wasn't going to be simple at all. By the early 1880s, the European powers had awakened to Africa, and everybody wanted a slice of that magnificent cake. With powerful empires like England, France, and Germany pursuing their own colonial interests in Africa, they wouldn't like it when Leopold, the monarch of weak Belgium, tries to snatch away such a huge piece of the cake. But Leopold was no ordinary monarch. He was the fox, he was the shrewd monarch. Having spent decades among the highest political circles of Europe, he understood the inner workings of government, and it was time to put that expertise into use. First, he decided to shoot for the White House, because once one of the great powers has recognized you, all the others are likely to follow suit. And Leopold's best bet was on the United States, for it would be much easier to convince an empire which had no colonial interests in Africa than, say, the British or the French. Being the shrewd monarch, he knew that in the day-to-day operations of the Washington political apparatus, nothing is more valuable than well-established connections. After all, it's human beings who make the decisions. And if you have the goodwill of the people with the right positions, you can exploit their political power for your own aims. And luckily for the king, he knew so many people among the political elite. One of such people was a wealthy businessman and former American ambassador to Belgium, Henry Shelton Sanford. This former American ambassador had deep political connections that reached the highest positions of American political power, including congressmen, State Department officials, and even the president himself. With so much political capital in his pocket, the former American ambassador headed to Washington to lobby for the king. His first move was to invite the American president, Chester Arthur, for a vacation at his luxurious mansion in Florida. He rented a private railway car and brought him to Florida in the most luxurious fashion. The president and several of his colleagues spent a week enjoying themselves in Sanford's gorgeous mansion. Next in line was the Congress. For this, the king's lobbyists decided to employ gastronomic tactics. He rented a house near the White House and started inviting congressmen and cabinet members to dinner. He also paid influential newspapers to publish sympathetic articles about the king's activities in Central Africa. Combining his gastronomic campaign with full-scale charm offensive and a powerful propaganda campaign, he was able to win support for the king's colonial ambitions in the Congo. But he didn't put it that way. For the politicians and everybody else outside the king's innermost circle, the Congo was a philanthropic venture, an altruist attempt to civilize, industrialize, and free Africans from the slave trade. On the 22nd of April 1884, the Secretary of State issued a formal statement announcing its approval of the, quote, humane and benevolent purposes of the king, and recognizing the, quote, free state established by him. It was a grand success. Now the king can turn his face towards the great powers of Europe. Winning over the powers of Europe was a more difficult task, but again Leopold is a shrewd monarch. In France, he decided to send yet another well-connected man, an art dealer by the name Arthur Stevens. The dealer personally negotiated the king's colonial interests with the French premier and won favor for him. The king also paid large sums to the prominent French newspaper Le Temps to get sympathetic coverage of his supposed philanthropic work in the Congo. To finally break the camel's neck, he decided to exploit the bitter rivalry between the French and the British. He assured the French that if his Congo venture failed, they'd be first in line to buy his failed colony, and not the British. Thinking that the king would go bankrupt trying to build infrastructure in the untamed land of tropical Africa, the French agreed. They recognized the king's claim over the entire basin of the Congo River. Next, he went to the British and told them about his deal with the French. If the British didn't recognize his new colony, he would have to sell it to France, and that the British couldn't let happen. Thus, they agreed to do the same as America and France. That's what they call dark genius. By now, Leopold had already dealt with all of the great colonial powers of the time. All but one. Germany. Unlike the others, Germany was a special case. Sitting at the top there was Chancellor Bismarck, a genius politician and the iron-fisted unifier of Germany, who was no fool. When Leopold sent him a letter asking him to recognize his new state so as to facilitate the abolishment of the slave trade, the Chancellor scribbled on the text, swindle. Besides a passage talking about a confederation of free states, he commented, fantasies. When the king claimed that the final boundaries of his territory would be defined later, Bismarck laughed at the king for acting like, quote, a naive, selfish Italian who considers that his charm and good looks will enable him to get away with anything. But eventually, the shrewd monarch outsmarted even Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor himself. Again, he used the perfect intermediary. As powerful as Bismarck was, even he had powerful partners who could influence him. And one such partner was Gerson Blackroder, his favorite banker. Blackroder financed many of Bismarck's projects, and he was a man of much behind-the-scenes influence in Berlin. Leopold, who was also friends with the banker, asked him to lobby the Chancellor for him. In return, Blackroder received banking business in Belgium and a chance to invest in the Congo himself. Eventually, Chancellor Bismarck agreed to recognize Leopold's claim over the Congo. When the great powers of Europe assembled in Berlin to partition Africa in 1885, the conference unanimously agreed to recognize King Leopold's sovereignty over the Congo, ending the king's decades of struggle in victory. You did it. You, Leopold II, King of the Belgians, are now officially an emperor. The colony that you for so long desired is finally yours. Now it's time to begin the exploitation. Under Leopold's rule, the entire Congo basin became a rubber plantation, and its people became slaves. As the king and the corporations working by his side pocketed hundreds of millions of dollars, the people of the Congo experienced terror and carnage of unimaginable scale. Innocent Congolese were massacred at a magnitude that dwarfed the Holocaust. Tens of millions were slaughtered, and many more were left to suffer in poverty and conflict. Congo was turned into hell on earth. The terror that was brought upon the Congo by Leopold's colonial rule left scars that never healed to this day. Even though the country supposedly got its independence in 1960, more than 8 decades have passed, and King Leopold's ghost still haunts the Congo.